Welcome to our webinar. Most of y'all are not on video, which is fine, but feel free to jump onto video if you want to see each other. That's right, Kim Moore. And so welcome. We are really thrilled to be hosting our first webinar today. Big thanks to Karen Sue for organizing this, and really big thanks to Angela Irvine, who is going to be leading us through this webinar. The purpose of our webinar today is to learn more about how we can run our own research. We know that one of the challenges that we face in running community-based programs inside of California prisons is really proving through research the impact that we know we have. And it is challenging to get funding and to be sustainable without research to back up our work. And we also know that there's a lot of barriers inside of CDCR to research, and that research is extremely expensive. And so there's all kinds of barriers to us being able to run the kind of research that really proves the impact that we're having and allows us to make the case for our work. And really ensure that folks in prison have access to kinds of healing and transformative programs that all of you run. We also know that many of you have run your own research. You have done pre and post surveys. You've done other types of research throughout your years in this work, and that you have some understanding already of how to do this. Many of you have probably filled out these types of surveys before while you were inside. And so we are going to really kind of take it from the top today, though, and talk about how we might be able to, as a coalition, really deepen our ability to run research collectively and to create a deeper base of knowledge here in California that really supports transformative programs. So that's our big thinking for today. We are going to keep folks on mute for now, but we will be doing some group work throughout this webinar, and there's going to be a lot of time for practice and for questions to really work through creating what we're working on today, which is pre and post surveys. And so we'll have folks to speak up, and I'm gonna mute, I think maybe another couple people. Yeah. And so if folks want to be unmuted, you might be able to do it yourself, or we can do it for you. Just chat us, and if you have any questions, chat us, and we'll go ahead and get started. And so with that, Angela, I would love to turn it over to you, and I was going to let you, Angela, introduce yourself and say a little bit about the work that you've been doing and why you agreed to talk to us about how we can do a better job of researching.
Sure. I just want to welcome everybody. I have been a community researcher for the last 20 years. I am originally from Santa Cruz, California, and have a PhD in sociology from Northwestern, and when I completed that doctorate, I decided to go back home to help community-based organizations in my hometown to share tools that I had learned so that they could establish themselves as evidence-based practice. And one of those organizations was Barrios Unidos. So I, for the last 17 years, have partnered with Barrios Unidos and helped them with research within Santa Cruz, but also was a volunteer on the Barrios Unidos prison project for several years, and so had my own experience just running an informal program for lifers in Dual Vocational Institute and running workshops in a few other prisons as well. And so I also just am very familiar with how much programming is developed by men on the inside, and just have a ton of respect and love for all of the many different types of work that all of you are doing. So I'm really honored to be on the phone right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I'm going to start to change the language a little bit because of the conundrum that everybody's in vis-a-vis research within prisons. So before I start sharing my slides, I just want to place a little bit of historical context, which is that because prisoners have always been a very vulnerable group with regard to research, that medical researchers and social researchers have taken advantage of prisoners over the last couple hundred years. And so the CDCR has put in many, many protections to make sure that prisoners aren't taken advantage of when other people conduct research. And so that's why the process is so difficult to get approval to conduct research on the inside. And so the language that I want to encourage everybody to use, because where I know the timeline is really tough, and that there's an application that is due in May for everybody to apply for to get permission by December to conduct research, quote unquote. I just want to say that there's a fine difference between developing surveys, which would be research, and developing an assessment that you as programs can use to determine whether or not your program is working. So you as program leaders can always have the right to conduct pre and post assessments in conjunction with any assessments that are required by the CDCR. And so I'll go into that a little bit. And so it's really important for all of you to use that language that we're going to be talking about developing community-based assessments that you're going to be using for programmatic work. And then later, once you get approval to conduct research, you can share that assessment data with an external evaluator or researcher that could analyze that data for you. I'll go through those steps with everybody, but I just want to be super, super careful at this point, because you don't have approval to conduct research on the inside, that today we're going to be talking about each of you developing your own assessments that are going to be used for program use and not for research. Does that make sense to everybody? I don't know, nodding heads. I can see a few nodded heads. Okay. So if, Karen, could you go to the next slide? Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about evidence-based practices within a correctional or criminal justice context. So some of you may have heard this term, risk, needs, and responsivity. So there are researchers for the last 20 years that have developed this idea that there can be risk assessments, that there should in fact be risk assessments and needs assessments that drive decision-making within secure facilities as well as within the community, and that there's this third concept of responsivity, in which programs should be responsive to gender and to some degree race, although that's rarely talked about overtly. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And so I'm gonna, sorry, I can't see my own slide. So, so the really good thing about, let's see, oh, here we go. The really, really good thing about risk assessments is that the use of these assessments that determine how likely it is that somebody's going to be arrested of another crime. The really good thing about these instruments is that they have diverted low-risk people from court and from community supervision. That you know, and that has led to a huge reduction in incarceration for both youth and adults over the last 15 years. But we're going to talk about the challenges go ahead and go to the next slide. But the problems with risk assessment are that they're imprecise. So, you know, and these are, I imagine most people have seen these. You know, risk assessments are used within prisons, they're used by probation departments, they're used by parole offices, they're used everywhere, but they're imprecise. They can assign somebody to a risk level, but they can't actually predict exactly who is going to commit a crime. They can only predict, they can only assign somebody to a low, moderate, or high risk group and guesstimate what the percentage chance is that somebody's going to be arrested for another crime. The other problem is that while researchers have been very clear that, that correctional organizations, law enforcement organizations should divert low risk, you know, prisoners, probationers, parolees, the findings are very unclear about medium risk probationers and parolees. And the other contradiction is that, you know, the risk assessment that's used by secure facilities usually finds that lifers are very, very low risk. And so we have this constant contradiction where people who have the longest sentences are actually lowest risk. And so they're not helping the populations that most of us are working with and are really concerned about. So next slide, please. And then, so in addition to risk assessments, there are needs assessments. And, you know, these researchers like Andrew Zambonta, Ed Latessa, have decided that there are 8 big criminogenic needs that we need to assess you know, and sort of measure people by. And so those big 8 needs are parenting and family relationships, education or employment, substance use, leisure, recreation, peer relationships, emotional stability, mental health, criminal orientation, and residential stability. And, you know, I mean, in some ways I'm sort of neutral, but there are also some problems. So if you could go to the next slide, Karen. So the problem is that the concept that these are needs that drive crime, that idea is flawed. And that is something that the biggest expert on sort of the problems with this concept of criminogenic need is Chris Baird, who's on the board of the National Council on Crime and Delinquency. And if you go to the NCCD website, there are actually a number of essays and papers that he's written. And while, you know, if those needs are something that we all do have, right? We want to be connected to family, we all want to be employed, we all want to be connected to education. But his argument is really like, how do you know that any of those things are actually leading to somebody to decide to commit a crime? Like, there may be something entirely different that we're not measuring. And so he really is encouraging the field to not, not use these measures, and also, you know, it's pathologizing and not very strength-based. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, all of these assessments are what's called validated. So they've all been tested over and over and over again. And so, you know, economists and very, very quantitative people feel like, well, the good thing about these things is that they've been tested among many different populations. But go ahead and go to the next slide. You know, there can be validated, tested instruments that can feel really pathologizing and that they're not necessarily measuring what we as community leaders want to measure. And so this is actually, I hope I'm not putting anybody on the spot, but this is the CDCR behavioral assessment that CDCR is considering requiring that each program use at the beginning of and end. And some of these questions aren't terrible, but you can, like when I read them, it's like I get sort of, my shackles go up a little bit because I'm like, what are you trying to get at? What are you trying to measure? You know, so these statements, you get upset when you hear about someone who has lost everything in a natural disaster. Like, what does that have to do with anything? You're locked up because you had a run of bad luck. The real reason you're locked up is because of your race. When people tell you what to do, you become aggressive. Anything can be fixed in court if you have the right connections. Seeing someone cry makes you sad. And there are more judgmental questions as you go deeper into this particular assessment. And so my point is that science is good. You want to test an instrument, but that doesn't mean that any of you don't have the power or the skill to be able to develop your own assessment. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So go to the next slide. Great. So, you know, my point is that in addition to the assessments that you may be required to collect by the CDCR, it's possible to design your own assessments that capture the outcomes that you're interested in measuring. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So what I want everybody to think about, and this is going to be a sort of workshop via a webinar, which I know can be hard to do because we're all on the phone, but what I want everybody to start thinking about is that in your own assessment for your own organization, you can start to think about what are the attitudes and behaviors that you want to change with your program. And so some examples are, it may be that you want your participants to have more empathy towards people who have caused sexual harm. You want to deconstruct toxic masculinity. You want to participate in affirming, you want your participants to start participating in affirming ceremony or indigenous healing. You might want your participants to become a mentor to others. You might want your participants to become a community leader. And so I'm gonna, if you could go to the next slide, I'm gonna show an example of an assessment that was, oh wait, I'm gonna stop. So this is a practice moment. So if everybody on the phone could just take a few minutes to think about what do you want your programs to change? What are 1 to 3 attitudes or behaviors that you hope that that your participants will take away at the end of your programming? I'll give you 5 minutes. But if you have something sooner, raise your hand. Well, I can only see Sam and Gabe.
Hey everyone, so as you're writing and thinking, I know some folks maybe are on the move. I think one person maybe is in the car, so don't write if you're in the car. But hopefully most of you are at a place where you can think about this and write. You know, what are some attitudes and behaviors that you want to change through your program? And then we believe that each of you can unmute yourself. And so that's how we're gonna do this. So when you've written down your idea, if you want to unmute yourself and share with us your idea, and we can see how well that goes with the technology and the level of sound. And then once you've shared your idea, if you can mute yourself again so that we don't have background noise. Sound okay? Good.
That sounds good. Has anybody written down an idea that they'd like to share?
I mean, I had to write it down, just first thing that came to my head was self-awareness and and mindfulness. That was something I'd like to cultivate my music students, regarding just self-awareness, just understand and not being reactionary, I guess you could say.
That's awesome. Love it. Anybody else?
Sure, this is Beth. I think some of the things that we would like to see outcomes on are things like self-agency, people feeling empowered, and leadership skills to, for people to be the change they want to see in the world. Those are just a couple of things that came right off the top.
Love it. Love it. Who else has something to share?
This is Karen McDaniel from the Place for Grace. As I was thinking about it, besides the obvious things regarding our programs of family reunification, I'd really like to see the men and women inside see their role as vital, particularly fathers. Oftentimes they don't see their role as vital because they're in prison. So I'd like to see an increase in their awareness about how vital their role is. I'd like to see an increase certainly in their contact with their children. And I'd also like to see an increased ability for them to help address trauma within their family.
Beautiful. Love it. Who else?
Hi, this is Kim. I would, one of the things, well, a few things. One is just developing emotional intelligence. So the capacity to understand and notice the body sensations and the feelings of different emotions. Also to be able to understand the difference between having an automatic reaction and being able to respond with skill to a situation. And lastly, to move from debilitating shame to a more responsible and healthy sense of remorse that then can move into being able to be of service to others.
These are all so great. These are just exactly what, and I hope everybody's feeling like, yay, I get to measure whatever I want to do. Who else wants to share?
This is Mary Lou. Hello, everyone.
Hey.
How you doing? Well, of course, we everything that everyone said is in line with what we want, So I was just thinking of, I think Karen mentioned family trauma, but I think about more intergenerational trauma, And then also, I always think about having the men understanding. Someone just kind of hit it right now about learning how to forgive themselves. And then knowing that they're an asset to the community, seeing themselves as an asset to the community, or their families, all the things that everybody said, and about, there's a lot of things that we would love to talk about, but that's
Love it. Love it. Who else wants to share? We'll take a couple more. Anybody else?
This is Sam. I'm thinking about a stronger sense of empathy, listening deeper and developing compassion for the community and for the people that were affected by our crimes, their crimes. I think that's very important, and that's one thing that we're working towards. And measuring that, it's difficult, but I think it's something that can be done.
Love it. One more person? Anybody? Okay, that might not be natural. Okay, so why don't, Karen, can we go to the next slide? So I want everybody to hold on to those ideas. And what assessments do is they take all of these really beautiful, rich, deep ideas, and they think, and it allows you to think of ways, how do you actually measure change over time? And so I'm going to show some examples, but what we basically do is we develop a statement, and then we have options where people can either strongly agree, disagree or strongly disagree. Sometimes people will put a not sure or in between, you know, so you can make it a 4-point scale or a 5-point scale. But the idea is that you're going to have your list of attitude and behavior statements that then you share with everybody at the beginning, and they either agree or disagree with all the statements. And then you wait until the end of your program and you share the same sheet of paper, and then people, you know, your participants write out if they agree or disagree with the statements at the end. And what you would hopefully see is that those attitudes would change over time. And so, Karen, if you could go to the next slide, I'll show an example of an assessment. So just to give everybody some context, this is an assessment that was developed specifically by 12 leaders of color around the country who serve youth and young adults who have been charged with serious or violent crimes in the past. And what's really beautiful about this process is that we really got away with, let's think much broader than recidivism, right? Like, so many of our people get stuck into these, you know, having to measure these like very reductionist negative sort of outcomes. And so let's dream big. Let's think about what outcomes would we ideally love to have our young people experience over time. And so here are some examples, and we used a 4-point scale, and then we do have this option of does not apply to me. So I'll just read through them and hopefully inspire people to think about what they could do. So I think about my future when I make decisions. I know ways I can help my community. I'm interested in legal and safe ways to make money. I know about the history of my people. I believe I can be a leader. I believe I can make positive change in my community. I'm working on healing from past traumatic experiences. I have opportunities to make positive changes in my community. I have positive adults in my life. I have positive friends my age, and I know how to work through problems without violence. And so there are a couple of things I want to point out about these. First of all, we know that in secure facilities in particular, there's a wide range of reading skill, because some people have not had access to school, and there are other people who have been, maybe underdiagnosed, but some people have some learning disabilities. And so we always want to develop questions that are at about a 5th grade reading level. And so, you know, some of the outcomes that people were sharing are really big ideas, and sometimes we just need to develop some statements that are really straightforward and simple so that people can read them and understand them on an assessment. And so, you know, but hopefully people, when you read these, you see like, oh, these are like positive though. You know, these are the stepping stones to building a really beautiful, positive community. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Karen. And this is another moment of practice. And so I want everybody to take one of the attitudes or behavioral outcomes that you wrote down, one of the more complex ones, you know, or any of them really, and then change it to a 4 or 5-point scale. And Karen, can we go back to the last slide so people can just like see the examples? So again, take one of the outcomes that you wrote down on the last practice session and turn it into a statement like the ones you see on the screen. And I'll give you a couple minutes, and then I'll take volunteers again. And there's not really a wrong answer, by the way. Have fun. Okay, is anybody out there ready to share?
I guess I am. I'll take behaviors for 500, Karen. Kind of reminds me of Jeopardy. I think it has to do with like one of the beliefs. Like I believe that I control how I react to conflict. Strongly agree, you know, moderately agree, or.
Nice. I love that.
That's the only I came up with. It.
That's awesome, and you're driving, so it's really excellent. Somebody else who wants to share?
This is Dave Belden. I had another belief one. I believe I can work towards healing from my childhood traumas.
Perfect. Hey, Dave.
Hey.
Somebody else?
On the leadership and empowerment one, something like, I feel like I can make a difference. I feel like I can make decisions that will benefit me and my community, you know, positive.
Really great. Who else?
This is Sheila from Safer Communities. The more complex thing was empathy, and the statement was, I care about what others feel and need.
Oh, nice. Love it. Who else? Anybody else want to share? I get people I can see Sam or Mary Lou. I know you're on there. Do either of you guys want to take a stab?
Yeah, I wrote on the first one. Speaking towards empathy, I just simply asked, I feel sad when other people are hurt.
Oh, nice. I mean, you know, that's, but I like, you know, I like how you operationalize that. Even though it's a sad thing. Mary Lou, you want to take a stab since I can pick on you? Are you?
I was trying to stay out of it because I'm not a good gambler, you know. You know, it's I don't know. I have so many of them, but come on, Jeanette, help me out. I have Jeanette over here too. She's hiding in the corner.
Okay, I'll let you continue to hide.
I'm sorry. I'm juggling two things at once.
No, I know, that's fine. I know. I'm just picking on you because I know you. Oh, anybody else?
Come on, Jeanette, say something.
No, I know this usually is something that takes time, so you know I don't expect anybody to master this. But does anybody else want to share? And otherwise, we can move on to next how you put this all together. Anybody? Okay, thanks for those. Okay, so Karen, could you go 2 slides forward? Okay, great. So the next step is really thinking about how do we pull a whole assessment together. And the first thing that I want to say is there are a couple of concepts you want to think about. So even though each of you has your own special program, which is really important, there's this, when you're developing an assessment, the more organizations that band together, the better you will all be in the long run, because the more assessments you can collect at the beginning and the end that have the same questions in them, the more you'll build something that's called statistical power. And it's a sort of technical thing that goes on, and I don't know if anybody that's taken a statistics class will know what I'm talking about, but if you only have 10 people at the beginning and the end, with the statistics test that analysts have to run, it's going to be hard to prove that your questions that people answered your questions in the right direction over time. If you can try to get more like 70 to 100 pre and post assessments altogether, it's much easier to use statistics to prove that what you're doing is working. And so I know that TPW is this really complicated collaboration of many, many different organizations, but I just want everybody to think about who are some other organizations that do really similar work, and who might you be able to partner with to develop an assessment that you could use within your smaller group. So go ahead, Karen, and go to the next one. And so these are the steps, and Karen and Caitlin are welcome. They can share the link to this presentation to everybody so that you can all go back and think about what these steps are. Like, you don't have to madly write notes right now, but I'm going to go through every single step that you should go through as you develop your assessment. So before you even start, I think it's really, really helpful, before you even write down those basic attitudes and behaviors, I think it's really important for everybody to think about, what is my dream? Like, what am I trying to achieve? What do I want to see in 10 years? So that you have your North Star there and you can check all of your attitudes and behaviors to that North Star. So one example is, my dream would be liberation for communities of color. Right? And it could be anything. It could be really pie in the sky if you want it to be. And then the second step is to do what we were doing together as a group. List out what behaviors and attitudes you think you can change through your program while you're working with folks, inside, outside, wherever you're working with them. But what attitudes and behaviors do you think you could change? And it's good to keep that to nothing more than 20 to 25 questions, because otherwise the assessments get to be too long. But somewhere between 15 and 25 is a good range. And then you want to also do what we did as a group, turn those behaviors and attitudes into 4 to 5 point Likert scale questions, so that what you have starts to look like an assessment. Okay, next slide. And then, so I'm just going to stop right there. Does anybody have any questions about those first 3 steps? No. Okay, so then the next 3 steps are, what you want to do then is you'll have your assessment and you'll collect your assessment at the beginning of your program, and then you're going to collect it at the end of your program. And what's really good to really establish that difference between you as programmers who are developing assessments and collecting assessment data and firewalling yourself off from research, it's really good to then take your assessments and enter that assessment data into your own Excel spreadsheet, your own database. And then if assuming everybody gets approval from CDCR, then what you want to do is basically hire a researcher who could then analyze and review your results. And, again, like in an ideal world, you'll have permission from the CDCR to have somebody look at that data. Sort of some weedy information is that if you're collecting your own assessment data, what that gives you the power to do is then take all identifying information out of your database, right? So you can share your assessment data with a researcher that doesn't have any names or birth dates or something that might identify that individual person. And what that does is you're protecting, in particular, you're protecting prisoners from being manipulated in any way by a researcher, because you know, historically researchers have been really terrible people. So you want to do what you can to protect the people you're working with. And so you'll, you know, collect the data, scrub it of names and birth dates, hopefully get approval from CDCR to share that what we call de-identified assessment data with a researcher who can analyze it. And then based on what findings the researcher has, you can go back to your assessment and figure out, okay, maybe some questions didn't work very well, so we want to change the questions. And you can also revise your program. So it may be that you're really good at improving empathy and really good at improving leadership skills, but it may be that you're having a really hard time, your participants are having a really hard time reconnecting with family. And so maybe you want to add a module in your curriculum that focuses on family. So it's really cool to have somebody analyze your assessment data, because it gives you that kind of information and power to get even better. And I think that, what's the next slide? I think the next slide is the questions.
Can I ask a question just about that?
Of course.
So just to clarify the process, so we are allowed, in terms of programmatically, we can do pre and post assessments, collect our own data. So the key thing in terms of CDCR approval is that we can't have an outside researcher see or utilize the data. Is that correct?
Exactly.
So once we collect the data and enter it into a spreadsheet, can we do our own internal data crunching and utilization of it?
So I think that you don't want to tell the CDCR that, but of course you always have access to your own data. I think that's I'm just being honest, that's a gray area that, or certainly once you get approval from the CDCR, then you can analyze the data. I think the main thing that we want to set ourselves all up for is that if anybody wonders what you're doing, you want to be able to say, we're collecting assessment data and we're not going to analyze it until, you know, like any analysis will not happen until we have approval to conduct analysis, if that makes sense.
Okay, all right.
So I also have a question. We do a pre and post. I just sent you all a chat too, but we have a, Insight Garden does a pre and post assessment of the impact of our curriculum, like what's working well on different lesson plans and some agency questions. And when I ran the survey by the department, it wasn't a survey, when I ran the quote unquote assessment by the department, they said it didn't meet, it wasn't the kind of research we needed approval for. So they didn't even ask me who was doing the number crunching, because we have a similar thing where you grade it by number, and they didn't really seem, and we've also done 2 significant research studies which were graduate level, which required researchers going into the prison and doing interviews with people who are incarcerated in our classes and other classes, and that did require CDCR approval, which took months. But the pre and post stuff that we do, they said wasn't at the level of research that they cared about, so to speak. So we've done both kinds, and the pre and post assessment of like our curriculum and impact and feedback we get on our facilitators is not something that we needed to, they told us we didn't need to get formal approval.
So Beth, I have a question. Who did you run that past?
The CDCR research department, the actual research, the committee that reviews research. So this is like 2 grant cycles ago, and we had randomly put in a grant that we would be doing pre and post assessments. And so then we got ourselves in a fix because we were like, oh, this could actually be real research. But when we put when we showed them the tools, they didn't phase them. Now, when we actually had, like, I did research inside the prison I had another person who was a researcher. We did have to go through the internal review study. You know, we did have to go through the IRB process and go through the whole rigmarole and send them all the questions ahead of time and whatever. And that took like a year, almost a year for both approvals for both of those projects. So where it was more complex, where we had actual researchers going in and doing research, it required approval. When we just have our staff like handing out pre and post assessment tools, it doesn't seem like it raised any eyebrows. And we went through the same group.
So I just want to point out that legally, when program staff collect their own assessments, it's that type of activity is exempt from general IRB
right.
oversight. And so that is right. I think I just don't want to give people the advice that, oh, go ahead and collect your own assessments and the CDCR won't care. I'm just a little, you know, it's enough in the gray area that my advice is that once you all have an assessment, you run that past the CDCR and say, can our program staff collect our own assessments? And in order to do that, do we need this research approval or not? And hopefully they'll say, oh no, go ahead, and then you won't have to worry about it. It's just, you all know that, like, sometimes the ins and outs of CDCR are unpredictable. That's really good news though, Beth.
They were two very different things.
This is Caitlin. I'm just going to jump in right quick. Beth, sorry to cut you off. I think we can move forward with caution. I think probably most groups on this call have done pre and post work. And I think there are some new guidelines that came down from the Office of Research recently, including this kind of May deadline around submitting requests for research. I think one of our questions was, would doing pre and post surveys and then analyzing that data have to go through that process? And I think it is gray area that we're not entirely sure about. There is also the reality that the people who got innovative grants fundings are going to have to do a CDCR pre and post test. And I haven't seen a copy of that test. I think the PPW has been trying to influence what that test looks like, but we haven't seen that survey, whatever the CDCRs require its grantees to use. I don't know if anyone else has seen that. And so probably what will happen, or ideally what will happen, is we will create our own pre and post test that is much more based in a North Star that we all believe in, that we can use to administer, and that we are able to do it not necessarily having to go through all these processes, but ensuring that we use an abundance of caution so that we can use whatever findings we have to really make the case for an evidence-based assessment of the great work y'all are doing.
And so, Caitlin, if I understand that correctly, then what you're saying is, so my understanding was that the department wanted to use a tool, use a tool, which we saw what they were thinking of, across the board with all organizations, to come up with their own and then hire a consultant to analyze. Now, and then we don't know what that's going to look like. We're just talking about putting together our own thing. It would be more impactful if we did it as a group together as TPW.
That's right.
Questions. Okay. I just want to be sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just, I'm being as safe as possible. So I know that you as program staff have the right to develop your own assessment that you can collect the beginning and the end. I think that what's unclear is this new protocol, because quote unquote survey data is one of the things you officially need approval for. It may be that the CDCR is only concerned about whether or not you're bringing researchers in to the facility, or if they have to pull together their own data to give to you all. But you know, again, I want to set you up for success. So
thanks, Angela.
Yeah.
Any really, really good questions, comments? Does anybody else have any questions, follow-up questions about what we were talking about?
This is Karen McDaniel. I just had a quick question regarding the anonymity of the surveys, or assessments rather, not surveys. So you said, like, make sure before we send them out to a researcher that we would scrub them of names and birth dates. Is there a reason that's not obvious to me why we wouldn't just not gather names and birth dates? Or is there another reason why I would want that information for another purpose?
That's a really good question. You could, so in my experience, it's really helpful when you're gathering pre and post surveys to have obviously some really easy way to match the first survey and the second survey to make sure it's from the same person. And so what, you know, if you have some way to, like, I mean, you could have them, you know, in the case of CDCR, they could use their CDCR number, right, which most people on the inside know by heart, you know, so that would suffice, and that would be a unique identifier that you could share with a researcher. But we've also in the past, you know, for a variety of reasons, just like, you know, just from like a humanistic perspective, gone through a protocol where we have people put their initials and their birth date just because it feels more, you know, whatever, personal, and then that gets scrubbed later for researchers. So I think it's more of like a practice, like if you want to just, you know, run program and not have people have to write their CDCR number on something, or not. CDCR numbers are a good option though, where you wouldn't have to scrub it.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Thanks for answering.
Oh, you're welcome. Anybody else?
I don't know if this is a totally different topic that you don't want to get into right now, but what's the status of the CDCR requiring all of, at least the grant-funded programs, to do one pre and post that they are selecting?
Caitlin, you know, the TPW has been in conversation with the folks at the CDCR who are in charge of the development of the evaluation, specifically Ryan Sousa. And we have expressed our, the only word I can think of is discontent. Our opposition to the Texas Christian University tool that Angela pointed to earlier in the slides, because there's a lot of racial bias and a lot of other problems in that tool. And so we've made it clear that we do not support their moving ahead with that. And they've asked us for recommendations, and we've given them some of the information on the NCPD resources that Angela also mentioned. And I'm not sure yet if they've landed on a tool, where they are in that conversation. I can certainly follow up with them again to see if they've made a decision. I'm hoping that our advocacy takes them away from the TCU tool, but I'm not sure.
Any other questions?
No, this is really useful.
Oh, good. I think, is the next slide, I think I'm done. Is the next slide does it just say questions? I want to make sure I cover everything. Yeah. So you know, again, I'm trying to provide advice that's helpful and that leads to the highest chance of success of making sure that everybody can collect data and analyze it and count it as research down the line. And so, you know, there are obviously these moments that are sort of gray. And so, you know, for those people that do decide to go ahead and submit an application, I think it's by May 21st or 22nd, to get permission to use this data as research. You know, it may be that, you know, along the lines that Beth is suggesting, it may be that if you have an assessment and you call the research department ahead of time and say, hey, this is our assessment, do we need to submit this form? You know, they may give you verbal agreement ahead of time to say, no, you don't have to even worry about it, which would be awesome. If for some reason you do need to submit the form, I just want to give you the advice, which is at least when you're applying, create a firewall between the people that would be collecting the data and the people that would be analyzing it. So there was somebody that asked the question ahead of time, like, can you analyze your own data? Just for like IRB prisoner protection reasons, you might want to just say like, okay, we have Bob and Anna who go into, you know, into San Quentin, and they're running the programs, and we're going to have Karen do the data analysis down the line. That's just my personal advice. It's not that you need to hire somebody, it's just that you want to create a firewall and think about it and write that into the application. I don't know if anybody has any questions about that or anything else.
I have a couple thoughts that I wanted to open up for the group here too. Angela, this is Caitlin. First, thank you, Angela, so much for leading this conversation. It's really helpful, and thanks everyone for their thoughts. One quick question from Sheila that I see here, which I appreciate, is the CDC, identifying by CDCR numbers are public and traceable to folks, I think. So maybe that wouldn't actually equal scrubbed data, though I'm not positive about that. Angela, can you weigh in on that?
So that you would all know better than I. Like, I think that is probably true, right? Like, if I think there's some place on the CDCR website where you can try to track down somebody's CDCR number if you have their name already. So that is probably true. Like, you know, you could maybe say, like, give me the last 5 digits of your CDCR number so that you're not getting the full CDCR number. I personally am a fan of initials and birth dates and then scrubbing that later. You know, and then just assigning your own, like, participant number. It's really hard if you give somebody a participant number ahead of time that doesn't have any meaning for them, because they inevitably forget, and then it's really hard to match down the line. But that's a really good point. But, you know, but you can think about it like, or, you know, just give me the first, you know, 3 digits of your CDCR number, but you want to just think about something that's not traceable.
That's great. Thank you, Angela. And so I think the priority here that is just essentially making sure that we are protecting folks.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then in terms of, like, you know, obviously what Angela, you know, I've now met with Angela, PJ, and Nate, and then me and Karen met with Angela, and I just had to be told this a lot of times because I didn't understand it. And so I don't know if anyone else is in my same boat, but I kept kind of asking, well, why can't each group just create their own assessment, because they're going to want to know specific things according to their specific program and kind of are going to want to be able to prove their own individual program. And Angela again and again kind of graciously made the point to me, which is like, statistically speaking, that just doesn't work. And it runs a big risk, because if you have a really small number of surveys, then when you do a statistical analysis, it is very likely that it's going to appear your program's not working, even if it is working. Like, it's going to be what they call like a false negative, I guess. And so her recommendation for the TPW and really anyone else running transformative programs in California prisons to come together and try and get a collective data set about all of the work that we are doing, I think is really powerful and a really cool way for us as a coalition to try and work together and come together. And I think one way that we can think about moving forward is to put ourselves into kind of groups according to more or less what kinds of programs we're running. So, you know, one potential way to group things would be groups that really focus on family integration, or another could be folks, groups that focus on, you know, sexual harm, for example. Or it can be done in a different thematic way. So groups focusing deeply on trauma. So I think that really is a lot of our groups. And so I think one of the next steps for all of us who are on this webinar is we're going to follow up with an email and everything. And we can even do some thinking about it now while we still have Angela on the line, is how do we want to kind of sort ourselves into maybe 2 or 3 different buckets of groups to create 2 or 3 assessments that are a little bit more tailored to the types of programs we're running. So if one program, for example, is an arts program, we can have, or several programs are arts programs, we can kind of evaluate those in a bucket. Or, you know, if some are writing programs, etc., if y'all get me. So I think one of our next steps is to figure out together how we want to group ourselves. And then those groups are going to need to come together and think together about drafting joint assessments, right? And then it will be those groups that collect this bigger data set. So each group's going to go out and get their 10 pre and post surveys, and all of that data will be put together, and we will hopefully be able to work with a researcher, either if we get a grant to hire a researcher like Angela to do this, and if we don't get funding, then we're interested in trying to pursue graduate students to help us run rigorous statistical tests on this data. So really looking at like external researchers that can help us. So I kind of wanted to open that up, and Angela, if you have anything to add there to help us kind of move towards the next step of how do we really operationalize this as a coalition.
I don't know the full list of folks. I mean, I don't think it, like, to me, how you organize, I don't have an opinion about it, but I think that the idea of breaking into 2 or 3 groups to maximize numbers, I think is a great idea.
And do you think it makes sense to break up at all? What would happen if we all ran the same survey on transformative? What are the merits to breaking this up a little bit?
So I think that the opposite problem of running the same assessment on all the organizations is that your measures are too far from what everybody's doing, right? Okay. And so then they might not measure what you're doing well enough. So I think it's just really, like, I'm trying to think of what the next step I would do. I think what might be interesting for everybody to do is maybe Karen and Caitlin could lead this and just say, like, put out a quick little survey of all the organizations to say, like, what do you do? Like, what are you, what are the top 5 behaviors or attitudes that you're trying to change? Because it might be surprising, right? Like, it may be that an arts program is actually a leadership program, right? Or like, so they might match with insight, or, just there may be some combinations that aren't super obvious based on what people are trying to do. But, I think that, deconstructing toxic masculinity is very different than family integration. So you want to make sure that the groups are close enough to that they get to measure what they're doing close enough that they also show a positive outcome, if that makes sense.
That's great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How would folks feel about that, for us to kind of follow up with this really brief survey about kind of the key behaviors that you're hoping to change, or the key behaviors that your program is targeting, and from there kind of sort folks into 2 or 3 groups? We're gonna unmute folks. Does that, and questions and feedback now. So we're just creating this thing as we go. So what do y'all think?
Yeah.
It's a way to do it. I mean, it's a way to gather information in one place that will help inform where you go next. A survey, an online survey.
And Angela, what would you say would be a minimum sample size for the number of pre-surveys and the number of post-surveys?
What's the ideal sample size?
Yeah.
Ooh, did I just I don't know why I'm echoing. So I would say that ideally, if you could get around 75 pre and post, that would be great. Like 100 is sort of a magic number, but if you could get like between 50 and 75, like that definitely starts to improve things.
Okay, great. I mean, that feels really doable. Like y'all are all running all kinds of programs. One of the challenges or one of the realities is people run programs on different schedules. So some programs run for 8 weeks, some programs run for 2 years. And so that's something that the statisticians we work with will be able to help guide us through. But I believe that we can get that kind of sample size from our coalition's work. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm curious, what are people thinking? How are y'all, and feel free to unmute yourself to chime in here. What questions do you have? What are you thinking, if anything? While we still have Angela.
I'm also not going anywhere. So, once you sort of dive into all of this and then you're like, oh my God, I wish I had asked Angela these 5 things. Like, I'm always available. You can the next slide is my contact information. You can email me, you can call me in groups, I am always available to help all of you because I just, I want to support your work. I know how hard it is, and we need more community-based programming, so for folks on the inside.
Yeah, Angela, that's great. And I wonder, while we have the remaining folks on the line here, we have about 15 people on the line still. I would just love to hear from the people who are on the line. If y'all are down, or if I don't know if everyone on this line is able to make a decision for their organization, but if everyone who's on the line is down with this idea to group together and do a collective evaluation of transformative programs. Like, would you be, okay, so I'm seeing, yes, Beth, yes, Sheila, scrolling down.
Yes, Karen.
Karen McDaniel, yes. Other folks who are on mute? Sam?
Yeah, I would have to check, but I mean, me personally, I'm cool with that. But I would have to get permission or see what the thoughts are on that.
Perfect. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah.
Same.
Great. Thanks, Sheila.
Danielle. This is Kim. I think what I'm thinking, because we have 500 students each year and it's a year long, so I'm sort of thinking, well, so what makes sense for us? And I'm wondering if whatever the collective thing is not so much a full instrument, but it's maybe an agreed on set of 5 or 10 questions that then we agree to put into whatever we're doing that may be more tailored specifically to what we do, because it doesn't feel like if we're doing something that's like an intensive year-long program, and then there's others that are maybe doing something similar in the sense that it's mindfulness or it's trauma-based or whatever, but it's an 8-week program, it doesn't feel like that necessarily is. I guess I'm curious about how that's going to fly in terms of just common measures when we're at such different time frames or such different levels of intensity. So I'm wondering if there's kind of a both and here.
Great. Thanks for that question. Angela, can you weigh in?
Yeah, so this is getting very technical in terms of, so bear with me for those that get glassy-eyed when we talk about statistics, but there's something called dosage, right, which is how long and how intensive your program is. And so one of the, in addition to all of the Likert scale questions, you're going to want to ask questions like gender, race. Ideally, you want to ask about sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and think about some other background questions. But you'll also want to ask how long have you been in this program, at both the beginning and the end. So there are going to be some programs that because you run for 2 years, you're going to want to know if somebody's been in the program for a while. And then you're going to want to know how long it's been since the beginning survey and the end survey. And your statistician can control for all of that, right? So at the end, what you'll want to do is you'll want to run a test to see, did it make a difference if somebody was in a program for 8 months versus a year, or are all the programs moving in the right direction anyway? And there's actually some really interesting benefit to running programs, you know, and combining data across multiple lengths of time, because that you can ask that question, right? Does length of time actually make a difference? And there's no downside, right? Like you'll want to make sure that you have your participants making some sort of notation about which program they're in, because, you know, you can then compare. You can see if there are differences across groups. You know, a lot of times there won't be a high enough number to be able to tell. And you will, you know, you can have some agreements up front about who you share your findings with. So it may be that you decide internally you're going to run more statistics tests than you want to share with the CDCR, right? So it may be that you all agree, okay, we want our statistician to look at differences across groups, but we also want to protect each other so that if there are differences, we're not going to share that publicly. So those are just a bunch of thoughts, but you know, I don't know if people have follow-up questions about that.
I had a quick question for those that weren't able to join today. Is this being recorded? Well, it is being recorded. I see that right now. Recording. Hey, okay. Will it be available after for folks?
Yeah, it will be. We'll send it out to the listserv and then maybe post it on the website.
Yeah, we'll post it on the website because we have a website now here in Built It.
And that's what I was going to say. That would be awesome to put it on the website. I think it's very helpful to do that. Good idea. Thank you.
Yeah, and so it does sound like math has accounted for a lot of the questions that we're coming up with, right? So like this dosage trick, you know, how long programs run, how many people. I know like one of the challenges if people drop out of programs, what to do about that. These are all some of the questions that we've kind of talked through with Angela, and she's had a very mathematical answer to each of them. And so I think as more questions come up and as we start to design these, we can all kind of assess what the best way forward is, and she can kind of guide us on statistically how are we moving in a way that's going to give us the results that are the most beneficial for making our case. But really excited for the turnout on this webinar. You know, I think 22 folks showed up from our coalition, and we will put it on the website and share it for more people. But Karen and I will also be following up with next steps to really start getting us thinking about how we can do some of this collective research together. And as always, we're kind of like building this as we go, so really open to y'all's feedback and your best thinking about this. To be clear, like I am not a researcher, and Karen, are you a researcher?
No, not today.
Yeah, Karen's not a researcher today, and so we're just really trying to facilitate this process. So really encourage all of your best thinking here, and appreciate your participation. So with that, Angela, want to turn it to you for closing thoughts, and really want to just say also thank you for your time on this and for all your work. And we're really pumped to have you work with you to be able to work.
Well, again, thank you so much. I think the last closing thought I just want to mention is I know research can be really, really scary on so many levels, right? It's like, you know, you're not sure if you're asking the right questions. I think organizations get really scared that what if there aren't results at the end, or what if the results are really negative at the end? And I just want to encourage you to use me as a resource, because you know, I've been doing this for 20 years, and my belief is that you can structure research in a way that is where the results are always positive, right? So even if you don't get exactly the results you want, you can always frame it as a way of like, okay, this is my growing edge and this is what we're going to be investing in the future. Like you have the power to about what is going to be reported at the end, and you can protect yourselves and you can protect each other. And I have, over the years, I have ways to think about how to even create that structure up front. So, use me for that. And dare I say, I even think research is fun. And so, if you sort of think about what's the scariest thing for you, for those where this does feel scary, we can get you through that, and then it becomes really, really fun to see what you're really good at, and how to really amplify that, and get support. So.
Great. All right. Well, with that, we thank everyone. Angela, thank you. Karen, thanks for organizing the webinar today. And we will be following up with y'all who joined today, and we are so grateful for your time. Let's keep working together.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Take care.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Very helpful.
You're welcome. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.